The moment this aircraft touched down in New York, one question quietly spread through diplomatic circles and newsrooms alike. Where do you hold a former head of state when the entire world is watching? Not in a military base, not in a secret location, but in a detention center so controversial that some judges have previously refused to send people there at all. According to publicly available reporting, Nicolás Maduro, Venezuela's longtime leader, is now being held in the same Brooklyn jail that once housed some of the most closely watched detainees in modern American history. And the location itself may explain more about what's happening next than any courtroom statement ever could. Because this story isn't just about who was detained, it's about where, why, and what that choice signals to the rest of the world. The facility no one wanted to talk about, the Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn, commonly known as MDC Brooklyn, was never designed to become a symbol. Opened in the early 1990s, it was intended to be a routine federal holding facility, a place where people awaiting trial would stay briefly before their cases moved forward. But over the years, MDC Brooklyn developed a very different reputation. According to court filings, judicial opinions, and long-standing media coverage, the facility has repeatedly drawn scrutiny for infrastructure failures, staffing shortages, and internal management challenges. At various points, defense attorneys have argued that conditions inside the jail made it unsuitable for prolonged detention. Some judges publicly agreed, choosing alternative arrangements when legally possible. And yet, despite that reputation, MDC Brooklyn has consistently remained the default landing point for the most high-profile federal cases in New York. That contradiction matters, because when authorities decide where to house someone like Nicolás Maduro, every option sends a message, whether intentional or not. Why this jail specifically? On paper, MDC Brooklyn serves a simple function. It holds detainees who are awaiting trial in federal courts in Manhattan and Brooklyn. In practice, it has become something else entirely. Over the years, publicly known detainees have included internationally recognized figures from entertainment, finance, and organized crime cases. Individuals whose presence alone attracted global attention. This isn't coincidence. According to former federal officials speaking on background and past reporting, MDC Brooklyn offers three things that are difficult to replicate elsewhere: immediate access to federal courts, high-level security infrastructure already in place, experience managing media-intense cases. So when reports emerged that Maduro was transferred there following his capture, analysts weren't surprised, but they were concerned. Because MDC Brooklyn doesn't just hold people. It places them inside the U.S. federal justice system in the most visible way possible. To understand why this choice raised eyebrows, you have to understand MDC Brooklyn's recent history. According to Bureau of Prisons records and investigative reporting, the facility has faced widespread complaints from detainees and attorneys, multiple federal investigations into internal operations, infrastructure failures, including a highly publicized power outage in 2019 that left the facility without reliable heat or electricity for days. None of these issues were theoretical. They were documented, litigated, and discussed openly in courtrooms. And that's why the Bureau of Prisons has spent the last several years emphasizing reforms. Public statements indicate the agency added staff, addressed hundreds of maintenance issues, and implemented new oversight procedures. Officials have repeatedly stated that conditions have improved and that the facility is safe for both staff and detainees. Still, reputation lingers. And when a former head of state is placed inside a facility with that kind of history, the symbolism becomes impossible to ignore. The crowd outside. As these developments unfolded, something else happened. Quietly, but visibly. According to reporting from the scene, Venezuelan expatriates gathered outside the detention center, some holding flags, others filming on their phones. There were cheers, there were chants, and there was a sense, whether justified or not, that a chapter had closed. Importantly, this reaction didn't come from U.S. officials or courts. It came from people who had lived under the consequences of Venezuelan politics for years. That distinction matters, because it highlights the broader reality. This case exists at the intersection of law, diplomacy, public perception, and lived experience. And MDC Brooklyn became the physical point where all of that collided. Not the first president to pass through these doors. While Maduro's presence is extraordinary, it is not unprecedented. Public records confirm that MDC Brooklyn has previously held other former heads of state facing federal charges. One of the most notable cases involved Juan Orlando Hernandez, the former president of Honduras, who was detained there during his U.S. World trial on drug-related charges. That case followed a familiar pattern: arrest abroad, extradition, detention at MDC Brooklyn, trial in federal court. The outcome of that case is now part of public record, and legal analysts immediately began drawing comparisons, while also cautioning that no two cases are legally identical, especially when questions of sovereign immunity and international recognition are involved. The legal questions that haven't been answered yet, despite the images and headlines. Very little has been formally resolved. According to court procedure, initial appearances are often brief. Judges confirm identity, explain charges, and set future dates. They do not determine guilt. They do not resolve immunity claims. And they do not address diplomatic fallout. Those questions come later, sometimes much later. Legal experts have already suggested that Maduro's defense may raise arguments similar to those used decades ago by Manuel Noriega, the former Panamanian leader arrested by U.S. forces in 1989. That case established important precedents, but it also left room for interpretation, and unlike Noriega, Maduro's political status, recognition, and international context are far more contested, which means the courtroom battle ahead may reshape legal boundaries, not just for this case, but for future ones as well. Why conditions matter more than people realize. Here's the part most headlines skip. Where a detainee is held affects access to legal counsel, ability to review evidence, physical and mental well-being, and ultimately how a trial unfolds. That's why MDC Brooklyn's history continues to matter, even after reported improvements. Defense attorneys have previously argued that prolonged detention there complicated case preparation. Federal officials, on the other hand, insist the facility now meets required standards. Both claims can exist simultaneously, and courts will likely be watching closely. Because with international attention focused on this case, every procedural detail will be examined, not just for legality, but for legitimacy. The bigger signal beyond the legal mechanics, analysts see a broader message being sent. Placing a former head of state in a standard federal detention center, rather than a special or isolated facility, suggests an intentional framing. This is being treated as a criminal case, not a diplomatic standoff. That framing has consequences. It influences how other governments respond. It shapes how allies interpret U.S. intentions. And it raises a question many countries are now quietly asking themselves. If this can happen here, who could be next? International reactions begin to form. As confirmation of Maduro's detention spread, reactions did not arrive all at once. They arrived in layers. First came official silence, a pause that analysts often interpret as governments assessing how far a situation might escalate. Then statements began to surface. According to publicly reported comments, several regional leaders emphasized principles like sovereignty, non-intervention, and self-determination. These responses were measured, carefully worded, and avoided direct confrontation. That restraint is notable, because moments like this often force countries to balance two competing realities: long-standing diplomatic norms and the practical reality of U.S. legal reach. In this case, the tension between those two forces became increasingly visible. One of the clearest responses came from Mexico. In remarks delivered during a regular press conference, Mexico's president reiterated a position the country has held for decades: categorical opposition to foreign intervention in another nation's internal affairs. The language was deliberate. Rather than addressing Maduro directly, the statement focused on principles, historical experience, regional memory, and the belief that intervention has rarely produced lasting stability. At the same time, Mexico emphasized cooperation on humanitarian and security concerns, particularly related to drug trafficking and public health. This dual message, "We will cooperate, but we will not endorse intervention," reflects a broader regional concern, because the implications of this case extend beyond Venezuela. Why this case feels different. Observers quickly began comparing the situation to previous U.S. actions in Latin America. But experts caution against oversimplification. Unlike past interventions that relied primarily on military force, this case is unfolding through indictments, extradition processes, federal courts, and detention facilities. In other words, through legal mechanisms, not battlefield decisions. That distinction matters. It suggests a shift in how power is exercised, from overt force to judicial process. Some analysts see this as a normalization of international accountability. Others see it as an expansion of jurisdiction that could create long-term instability. Both interpretations are being debated, often quietly, behind closed doors. The question of precedent legal scholars have focused on one word: precedent. If a former or sitting leader can be detained and tried under these circumstances, what does that mean for others accused of similar conduct? Historically, heads of state have relied on diplomatic immunity, recognition by other governments, and the difficulty of cross-border enforcement. But those protections are not absolute. Past cases, including Manuel Noriega's, showed that courts may defer to the executive branch on questions of recognition and immunity. In this case, U.S. prosecutors have reportedly referred to Maduro as a de facto leader rather than a legitimate one, a distinction that could prove central to upcoming legal arguments. The courts have not ruled on this yet, and until they do, uncertainty remains. Inside MDC Brooklyn, the practical reality, while governments debate principles, day-to-day reality continues. Inside MDC Brooklyn. According to Bureau of Prisons statements, detainees in high-profile cases are often initially housed in more isolated units, a standard procedure meant to ensure safety and order. This isolation is not unique to this case, but given the facility's past, attorneys and human rights observers are paying close attention. Federal authorities maintain that recent reforms have addressed prior deficiencies. Additional staff infrastructure repairs, reduced inmate population. They also point to a reported decrease in internal incidents. Critics, however, argue that transparency remains limited and that trust, once lost, is difficult to rebuild. That tension is likely to follow this case at every stage. Familiar faces, uncomfortable, proximity. Another detail, quietly noted in reporting. MDC Brooklyn currently houses individuals connected, directly or indirectly, to Venezuelan political and criminal cases. One example includes a former intelligence official who previously broke with Maduro's administration and later indicated willingness to cooperate with U.S. authorities. The proximity of such figures raises obvious questions about information, leverage, and security, though no public evidence suggests improper interaction. Still, in cases this sensitive, perception alone carries weight, and perception often shapes narratives long before facts are fully established. Maduro's initial court appearance is expected to be procedural. According to standard practice, charges are formally presented, legal representation is confirmed, future dates are scheduled. There is typically no testimony, no evidence review, and no verdict. But symbolism doesn't wait for verdicts. Images of a former leader entering a U.S. courthouse, under guard, under jurisdiction, resonate far beyond legal filings. They travel instantly, and they invite interpretation. As this case unfolded, separate comments from U.S. leadership regarding other countries in the region drew attention. Some remarks were described by analysts as rhetorical rather than operational, signaling posture more than policy. Still, when combined with real-world actions, rhetoric can amplify concern. Officials in neighboring countries responded by reaffirming sovereignty and emphasizing diplomacy. Defense ministers stressed ongoing cooperation while distancing themselves from speculation. This pattern, reassurance paired with caution, reflects a region watching events closely, aware that today's exception can become tomorrow's norm. Perhaps the most significant question emerging from all of this is not about Maduro specifically, it's about method. For decades, global power struggles often played out through sanctions, proxy, conflicts, or direct intervention. Now, increasingly, they appear to be moving through indictments, arrest warrants, extraditions, and detention centers like MDC Brooklyn supporters argue this represents progress, accountability without war. Critics warn it risks politicizing justice and destabilizing international norms. The truth may lie somewhere in between. But one thing is clear: the courtroom has become a new front line. Despite the headlines, many things have not occurred. No trial has begun. No immunity claims have been ruled on. No diplomatic resolution has been reached. No long-term outcome has been determined. We are at the beginning of a process, not the end. And in complex international cases, beginnings are often the most unpredictable part. Why the world is watching the jail, not just the charges. It may seem strange that so much attention is focused on a detention facility rather than a courtroom. But MDC Brooklyn represents more than a location. It represents jurisdiction, control, visibility, and intent. By choosing this facility, U.S. authorities placed the case firmly within the standard federal system, not above it, not outside it. That decision sends a message about how this case is meant to proceed. Whether the world accepts that message remains to be seen. The long shadow of international law. As legal teams prepare their arguments and governments calibrate their responses, one reality is becoming increasingly clear. This case will likely outlive the individuals at its center. International law often evolves not through sweeping declarations, but through specific cases that quietly redefine boundaries. Legal scholars point out that moments like this tend to create interpretive gravity. Future prosecutors reference them. Defense attorneys challenge them. Judges measure new arguments against old rulings. Whether Nicolás Maduro is ultimately convicted, acquitted, or released on procedural grounds, the process itself may become the precedent. And that process is unfolding inside a federal system that treats this case as criminal, not diplomatic. What this means for future leaders. For decades, leaders accused of serious wrongdoing often relied on one assumption: that borders, recognition, or political status would shield them indefinitely. This case complicates that assumption. It suggests that protection may depend less on title and more on international recognition, diplomatic alliances, and how actions are legally characterized. Importantly, this does not mean every leader is suddenly at risk. Jurisdiction remains limited. Extradition still requires cooperation or leverage. Courts still require evidence and due process. But the threshold for possibility appears to be shifting. That shift alone is enough to make governments take notice. One of the least discussed, yet most influential elements in this case is recognition. Who is recognized as the legitimate leader of a country matters. Legally, in previous cases, including Manuel Noriega's, U.S., courts deferred heavily to the executive branch's position on recognition. In Maduro's case, prosecutors have reportedly described him as a de facto ruler rather than a legitimate head of state. That language is not symbolic. It may determine whether immunity arguments succeed or fail, and it highlights how legal outcomes can hinge on political determinations, even when courts strive for independence. Lost in geopolitical analysis is a quieter reality. Detention, even when lawful, is restrictive. Legal proceedings are slow. Uncertainty is constant. While this video avoids speculation or dramatization, it's important to acknowledge that cases like this involve families, supporters, opponents, and entire populations watching from afar. For Venezuelans, this moment may represent hope, fear, vindication, or concern, sometimes all at once. And for others across the region, it raises deeply personal questions about power, accountability, and sovereignty. Why this isn't just about the United States. Although the case is proceeding in a U.S. courtroom, its consequences are not confined there. Allies are watching how evidence is presented, rights are upheld, conditions are managed, and rhetoric is restrained. Any perceived overreach could undermine credibility. Any perceived restraint could strengthen it. This balancing act, enforcing law without appearing arbitrary, may be the most difficult challenge of all. Returning to MDC Brooklyn, its role now appears clearer. The facility represents normalization. By placing a former head of state in a standard federal detention center, authorities framed this case as one governed by existing rules, not exceptional measures. That framing reduces the appearance of retaliation or spectacle. It also increases scrutiny, because when a case is treated as ordinary, it must withstand ordinary standards and extraordinary attention. The next phase will be slower and quieter after the cameras fade. The real work begins. Pretrial motions, jurisdictional challenges, immunity arguments, evidentiary disputes. These stages rarely make headlines, but they decide outcomes, and they take time. Months, sometimes years. During that time, public interest may shift, but legal impact accumulates. If there is a lesson forming here, it is not about punishment or power. It is about process. This case suggests that the modern international order may increasingly rely on courts instead of coups, indictments instead of invasions, legal filings instead of declarations. That approach is imperfect, it is slow, and it is often contested. But it may represent an attempt, however flawed, to replace force with framework. Beyond the jail, beyond the charges, beyond the individual. The real story is about how accountability is enforced in a world where borders still matter, but no longer protect in the same way they once did. In the next video, we'll examine how courts decide when a leader loses immunity, and why some cases move forward, while others never leave the indictment stage. That distinction may explain not only what happens next here, but what might happen somewhere else sooner than expected.
Un clan de pedófilos quiere acabar la democracia en Colombia. Duro, sí, pero ahí está la realidad. Y para que no salga la lista, entonces nos envían acorazados a matar pescadores de esta ciudad. Y amenazar al vecino, que si dictador o no. ¿Cómo que el pueblo de Colombia va a aplaudir que invadan a su hermano, que no es el presidente, sino el pueblo de Venezuela? El gobierno de Venezuela ha hecho muchas críticas, pero no me burlo del pueblo de Venezuela, ni construyo una trampa para que caiga el pueblo de Venezuela en la trampa de una invasión que solo va por su petróleo. La lista de los amigos de Stein, que no quiere que aparezca la lista en los Estados Unidos, nos quiere utilizar aquí con la violencia para que el pueblo de los Estados Unidos no piense en su propio gobierno, sino que se le suba la xenofobia, el racismo, las ideas de la raza superior y otras ideas falsas, y nos usan para no discutir sus propios problemas. El presidente de Colombia lo que ha hecho es denunciar narcotraficantes durante décadas. Y los narcotraficantes que ha denunciado siempre estuvieron en el poder político de Colombia, en el Estado.